Um, Good morning, welcome everyone. Les damos la bienvenida to the Assuming the Podium, a symposium on Luisa Capetillo. We are delighted that you're able to join us today, and we are very excited because this is the work of at least a couple of years in the making. So first, let's start with our introductions. So Amy, introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Nancy. Hi, everybody. My name is Amy Olin. I'm assistant professor in translation and interpreting studies, and I've had the pleasure to work with Nancy for the past few years on creating this bilingual edition of Capetillo's first two essays. So we're really excited to see all of you here today and to spend some time talking about and learning about Luisa Capetillo.
Thank you, Amy. And I am Professor Nancy Bird Soto. And I'm in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at UWM. And I've been researching Capetillo for quite a while now, and there's always something new and fascinating about her. So a little bit about how this symposium came to be. So Professor Olin, so Amy and I had been working on this bilingual edition of Capetillo's first two essays, and those are Ensayos Libertarios from 1907 and La Humanidad en el Futuro from 1910. So, and why were we doing this? Well, there is the Obra Completa, Luisa Capetillo and the Obra Completa in Spanish, that wonderful edition by Norma Valle Ferrer. We also have the other two bilingual editions of Capetillo's better known works that are her later works that are Mi Opinión, right? And that's the edition of Felix Matos Rodriguez. The translator is Alan West Duran. And that's for, the title for that one is A Nation of Women. And then we have the one by Lara Walker with the title Absolute Equality. And that is the bilingual edition and with the translation of Influencias de las Ideas Modernas. So the first two essays that Capetillo wrote still needed that bilingual edition. And so Amy and I took up this project. And as we met over the last, well, nearly 2 years now via Teams, so we were talking about how to also bring this process to a wider audience of scholars, of students, of people who are interested, maybe not specifically necessarily on Capetillo, but also translation and working with texts that are outside the canon. So we were also thinking Capetillo passed away in 1922. So this is actually the centenary of her passing. And so in light of that, right, also looking at Capetillo and her works and her ideas in the context in which, she wrote and she lived, and also see the relevance of those texts and those ideas today. And also an interesting fact that today, October 28th, would have been her birthday, and that it happens to be on a Friday this year in 2022. So, so we thought this is a good time to do to present the symposium, right? And keep in mind that we are actually recording the keynotes and the panel with between Amy and I about textuality of the text. So you would have different, so it's going to be in parts, so you don't have like a huge 4-hour Zoom recording if you want to watch this later on, or maybe share with your students. What else? So let's see, we have here the program. So again, welcome everybody, and feel free to stay for the whole symposium or join whenever, the parts that you can. First, we have the first keynote with Dr. Stephanie Rivera Berruz. Then we have the panel Textuality of the Text. Notice that we have a short break there, right? And then we go on to the student panel, so that we also see the perspective of students, people who are encountering Capetillo for the first time and those first impressions, right? So also to add that component to the symposium. And then we have our second keynote, Dr. Llorel Melendez Vadillo. And with that, we will wrap up the symposium. keep in mind that we will try the best we can to check, if you have any questions, if you can put them in the chat, and we will try to address them the best way we can. If there's any lingering questions, you can always email us so that you know that you can use the chat function. Amy, anything else you would like to add in terms of the putting together of the symposium, or anything else you would like to add from your end?
Yeah, thank you so much. We're very excited to see everybody here today. It's been really fun for Nancy and I to work across disciplines, so Spanish and Portuguese, and then translation and interpreting studies, and to kind of see this symposium also be a nice representation of interdisciplinarity, which, as we were working on her text, we discovered is something that, a vantage point or a lens through which we also needed to view her work. So we're excited to see folks from different academic walks of life here today. Just wanted to say thank you to our co-sponsors at UWM. So thank you so much to the UWM Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, CLACS, also to Spanish and Portuguese at UWM, Translation and Interpreting Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, and also the MA in Latin American, in Language, Literature, and Translation, or MALT, and also Sigma Delta P, the Hispanic National Honor Society. Thank you so much for your support and helping us bring our keynotes to the symposium today. And of course, and always, a special thanks goes to Julie Klein for really putting in so much work to create these spaces of exchange and dialogue. We couldn't do a lot of this work without you, Julie. So thank you so much for everything you've done, putting together this beautiful poster, organizing the Zoom outreach. Thank you so much for all you do for the center and also for all of us at UWM and the region. So with that, Nancy, is there anything else any other comments you'd like to make before we?
Well, yeah, also that since I know some people may have other commitments or they're teaching also as well, we will try to start, like, we're not going to start the keynote like a minute or two before. So we want to start things as they are listed here on the program, just so that people don't miss anything if they were, coming here to listen to that one specific panel. However, if something needs like an extra 5 minutes, that's fine. We have some wiggle room here, especially between 11:50, 12:05. So, that would be that sort of like middle break between the panels. And that, we have it up to 2 p.m. The keynote, the second one is listed here, program until 1:45. So again, just in case something runs over, we have wiggle room. So just that, if anything ends earlier, remember that we will start, we wouldn't start anything earlier than what is listed here, just so that people join and they find what they were looking for. So with that said, and we're just a couple of minutes before our first keynote, I will not do the introduction just yet, but Stephanie, Professor Rivera Berruz from Marquette University, I could share my screen with the PowerPoint that you sent me, or if you would rather, get that PowerPoint going and I can stop then sharing my screen so that you can share yours.
Whatever's easiest. I mean, I can flag for you when I need slide changes. There's only like 7 slides, so I can't imagine it would be too difficult, but.
Okay, is that your preference then?
I mean, I'm equal about it, so.
Let's see. Let me stop sharing for a second here, and okay. I will pull up your presentation, which I have here, and okay, so I can start sharing the screen again. Okay, let me make this bigger. Okay. Oh, all right. And Okay, so beautifully it is 10:10. So here we have our first keynote speaker, Dr. Stephanie Rivera Berruz, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Marquette University. She was a recipient of the Woodrow Wilson Career Enhancement Fellowship for her work on Latin American philosophy for the academic year of 2017-2018. Her main research interests lie in Latin American philosophy and Latinx feminisms, as well as the philosophy of race, gender, and sexuality. She co-edited the anthology Comparative Studies in Latin American and Asian Philosophies in 2018, and her publications appear in Hypatia, Inter-American Journal of Philosophy, Essays in Philosophy, and others. And the title of her talk today is In the Face of Modernity, Luisa Capetillo, Free Love, Spiritism, and Emancipation. So whenever you're ready, you let me know. And when I need to move on to the next slide, you just let me know.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here. Thank you to all of the sponsors and everyone who's on the call. I am really honored. I started working on Luisa Capetillo about 5-6 years ago. And I think some of the first work I read was Nancy's. So I can't even, yeah, you were one of the first people I bumped into in the literature. And then, you know, the world would have it that we would live down the street from each other 4 years later, right? And I would get to see you and come join your courses and visit. So it really is an honor and a pleasure. I am super excited to be here. Okay, so we can go ahead and start with the first slide. All right, so part of what I want to do today is, I mean, as the title suggests, I want to talk about Luisa Capetillo's Spiritism. Specifically, I'm interested in the ways in which if we can look at the ways that her spiritual framework influences her politics, right? And so this was really my point of departure for this particular project, is I don't think that her stuff on spiritism gets nearly as much attention as the stuff on free love and labor activism, which I think are super important, but there's some, I think, missing parts. And I think the spiritual framework, I think, has a lot to tell us. So that's just a little bit of the kind of point of departure. So Luisa Capetillo, right, often heralded as one of Puerto Rico's first feminist figures, as everybody here I think knows, right? Was an anarcho-feminist activist, and her life very much reflected her philosophical commitments. She forges her intellectual and political life during a time of fervent anarchist and working class activism, largely emanating from Puerto Rico's tobacco factories, epicenters of radical activism that demanded an end to class hierarchy, private property, religion, and nationalism. And in this context, she creates an intellectual framework oriented around the emancipation of women, advocating for economic self-sufficiency, sexual education, and class struggle, undergirded by the importance of sexual autonomy for women's lives. As an activist and an intellectual figure, she gained contemporary notoriety largely centered by her perspectives on working class politics and their intersections with sexual ethics, right? As well as her extensive publication record that materially accompanies her living memory as La Mujer con Pantalones, yeah? And I think I'm in a good audience here for that, in knowledge base of the ways in which she's understood. Scandalously defiant, she was a prolific writer, loud and disruptive voice, particularly in terms of sexual rights, the abolishment of marriage, and the possibilities of free love. And in this context, Capetillo emerges as a defiant figure that, as I'm sure Dr. Jorel Melendez Vadillo will later talk about, she assembles what he calls a counter archive. And I want to flag already the kind of intertextuality that at least my project has with the work of Jorel that's going to come later in the day. So, okay, so Capetillo's intellectual patchwork pulled from the sources available to her, right, at the turn of the century in Puerto Rico, in a world post-US occupation with a ravaging capitalism, in the faces of what I'm going to call the catastrophes of modernity. In her writing, she forces readers to witness an unruly way of thinking, one that sought to keep what to many were incommensurable positions in the same room with one another. Imperialism, argues Gloria Garcia Peña, requires addiction as much as it requires weapons and money. And so imperialism then is going to also require stories and narratives that justify its own barbarism. And I think in response to the dictions of empire, the dictions of barbarism, Capetillo opens a space of contradiction that defied the logics of empire and modernity. And I think this fact is felt mostly in her positions on what she took to be the commensurability between anarchism and spiritism, which I think for most folks, right, we read this as a place of tension. And I think it's an interesting place of tension that I want to kind of explore a little bit further, where we see a bit of her ungovernmentality, where she proves to be quite subversive, given that anarchist politics left very little room for the connections with spiritual life, and Capetillo insists on the importance of both being absolutely commensurate with each other. And so her synthesis of anarchism, radical sexual politics, and spiritism, I think really holds an important key to understanding her whole intellectual patchwork, which is what I'm kind of after, philosophically speaking. And so that's what I'll be taking up today. I want, for this reason, to read the seemingly contradictory, intense patchworks of ideas to demonstrate how her commitments to spiritism are actually woven into her ideas of liberty, emancipation, and resistance. And although they're seemingly contradictory, I think she gives us reasons to believe that they might not be. So, all right, with that, we'll move on to the next slide. Let's get the project unfolding. Okay, so Capetillo develops her thought in an intellectual moment in Latin America and the Caribbean, where ideas about natural life and claims about moral and social life, religion, were consistently more and more distant from each other. The Enlightenment and the scientific revolution made possible in a global key the distinction between science and religion. Moreover, the independence movements of the early 19th century that swept Latin America and the Caribbean made political concerns about the consolidation of nation states, social stability, and integration of diverse population in the wake of colonization a very predominant concern. The ambition was participation in the project of modernity through the establishment of economic social progress as defined by Europe and subsequently the United States. And here, things like positivism, primarily through the works of Auguste Comte, Herbert Spencer, and Ernest Haeckel, take intellectual hold as they upheld the importance and primacy of science and rational thinking. The positivist motto of order and progress was particularly appealing for nation state building. It should come as no surprise that the same motto is found on the Brazilian flag to this day. In emphasizing the importance of science and pragmatic solutions, positivism would come to be used as an ideological mechanism for diverse ends of nation states, from educational reform to doctoral regimes. By the end of the 19th century, Latin America and the Caribbean had witnessed the ascendancy of scientific ideas over the realm of politics, which came to merge the human with the social animal evolution framed by Darwinian theory. The consequence here was a blurred division between the animal and the human, a distinction which plays a key role in the justification for conquest, as well as the modernities that it produced. In linking the human and the animal through a theory of evolution, Darwinian theory introduces a framework that understands the human in relationship to the animal, but as a relationship of degrees, but not of kind. As a result, morality emerges as a category that separated human beings from other animals, particularly in the structuring of civilization. The demarcation between the human and the animal as a matter of degrees further marks moral progress, that is, the progress endemic to European modernity, as the note of civility and decency counterposed to the barbaric and the primitive. The space of the moral subsequently becomes a critical point of nation state regulation that demarcates racial, gender, class, sexual difference, and exclusion in various valences. Racial difference emerges as proximal or synonymous with the animal, even if paradoxically inconsistent with his theory that species were not fixed. The idea of human races is invoked to ascribe certain qualities, often moral, to whole groups of people, the wake of which constructs our contemporary racial orders. It's for this reason that Achille Membe in Necropolitics argues that the colonial system manufactured conditions that sought to deaden people's ability to be affected by suffering. It's no surprise, and as I'll talk about shortly, that in this context of Capetillo's world, codes of moral decency and respectability were key mechanisms in the regulation of race, gender, and sexuality in post-US occupation Puerto Rico. Moral dissent morally decent people were white people, rational humans, capable of enacting moral agency, a paradoxical moral agency, to be clear, one capable of producing conditions of liberty, freedom, and democracy, undergirded by the extermination, exploitation, and disenfranchisement of others. Rationality, a linchpin in the construction of the human, became a barometer of knowledge production with a moral orientation that understood philosophy, science, and education as tools of civility. And so here, nature emerges as a category that favored the perfection of the species itself and implied a distancing from spiritual beliefs that could not be commensurate with rationality, a point which Capetillo resists very actively throughout the length of her work. On the stage of the human and the scientific, claims about spiritual life had to be packaged in a rational key if they were to intellectually coexist. And so heeding this call, French educator Hippolyte Léon Dinzard Rival, I really don't know how to actually pronounce his name, but he later switches it to Alan Kardec, which is the name we know him most by. And this name was actually supposedly based on reincarnations learned through medium communications. And this will actually be important for the conversation on spiritism down the line. Alan Kardec develops a scientific doctrinal approach to spiritual life, and thus is born the idea of spiritism. Spiritism traces its origins to spiritualism, right? So to be distinguished, which is broadly understood through belief in the ability to communicate with the dead in and through practices like levitations, table wrappings, and trances by people commonly referred to as mediums. Popularized by the Fox sisters, specifically in Hydesville, New York, spiritualism travels to Europe and captures the imaginations of many. In 1848, Leah, Kate, and Margaret Fox began hearing strange knocks in their parents' cottage. The knocks came to be understood as communications from the dead in the form of code. And so the sisters treated the knocks as mechanisms of communication with a murdered peddler whose body they thought had been buried underneath their cellar. The remains of this man were actually later discovered to be there. However, the Fox sisters later report that their claims about spiritualism were based on lies. So there's some very interesting tensions of storytelling here behind the scenes of what the Fox sisters talked about. In response to the North American variation, Kardec develops a rational approach, what he calls a rational approach, to spiritual life, bridging the relationship between the material and the spiritual, which categorizes European historical milieu. Ostensibly, Kardec develops a system of thought that could account for spiritual life without the edifice of organized religion in the face of the conditions of European modernity that employed ideas from the scientific revolution. Key for the purposes of this chapter is the fact that spiritism is developed as a moral philosophy, and he's very clear about this, and distinguishes itself from a religion, a point that heavily influences the way Capetillo talks about her central tenets of Espiritismo as a moral framework that could guide the perfection of the human alongside her anarchist politics. Spiritism makes landfall in the Caribbean during the mid-19th century. As is the case with many religious systems in the Caribbean, Spiritism forms part of already creolized transculturated religions that evolve out of forcible contact. The results are complex and pluralistic spiritual schemas and practices that can be found throughout the Caribbean to this day. Syncretic in nature, the spiritual systems of the Caribbean are often based on the juxtapositions and the coexistence of African, indigenous, and Catholic elements. And so in this context, in the context of Puerto Rico, Espiritismo develops due to the large influx of European migration to the island on the heels of the Royal Decree of Thanks, which happens in 1815, making it very easy for European migration to happen. So with European migration came the flow of new ideas, chief among these, right? Spiritism, which would come to be a major ingredient in the creolized Afro-Hispanic Espiritismo, and further down the line, Santerismo, that continues to be widely practiced both in Puerto Rico and in the diaspora. Against this intellectual backdrop in the Caribbean and Latin America, as well as in Puerto Rico more specifically, Capetillo constructed a unifying theoretical framework that could account for the social and political life, as well as claims about spiritual and natural life. And so the result is a patchwork of ideas that I think sent to the freedom for women as part of a much larger project that unsettled the centrality of the state alongside the centrality of religion, which were foiled together. All right, so a little bit, let's switch slide and we'll talk a little bit more about what she was actually after. Okay, so like many Latin American and Caribbean intellectuals of her time, Capetillo's ideas are rooted in larger theoretical projects. She understood social political emancipation as a problem that stretched beyond, or one might even argue despite, the modern nation state, given her anarchist positioning. For her, the project of liberty is constructed in and through the dynamics that regulate intersubjective relationships. Consistent with her anarchist commitments, freedom was not imparted by the nation state. Rather, freedom emanates from the systems that connect and give meaning to the intimacy of human relations. Hence, marriage, love, class, education, and religion were sites of critical philosophical intervention, understood as interconnected nodes that constitute the fabric of social life. Contemporarily, conversations about the life and work of Capetillo have vibrantly emerged amongst a cohort of intellectuals. I think many of those are in this virtual room with us today, that continue to take up a lot of the challenges and that she poses. And so one of the most unique and I think underexplored facets here, right, have to do with her reconcilability between spiritism and anarchism. The dominant strands of anarchist thought that Capetillo worked with and through were staunchly critical of organized religion. As a political theory, anarchism is critical of the justifications of authority and power, grounded in moral claims about individual liberty. Liberty, as is deployed in the works of Capetillo, is a negative freedom, that is, a freedom from domination that sets up the conditions for a positive notion of freedom that makes equality and non-coercive community building possible. Anarchism as a political philosophy is skeptical of the legitimation of state authority, and in the context of Capetillo's work, political anarchism translates to political activism. That is to say that her skepticism over the legitimacy of state authority translates to a way of life that resisted the state as the primary source of exploitation. Her commitment to not marrying, as well as to her fervent labor activism, I think reflects this point even more. She very much lived out her commitments. The critique of the legitimacy of centralized authority often extends towards religious centralized authority. As can be seen with the context of Puerto Rico and many other places in the colonized world, the role of centralized religious authority, in this instance, specifically the Catholic Church, is woven into the legitimacy of state sovereignty that justified conquest, it justified occupation, it also justified the extermination of people in the name of rational progress and civility, that is, in the name of modernity. If the legitimacy of the state was to be found in Catholic values, then resistance to the state is also going to be resistance to the Catholic Church. Hence, the assembly of an intellectual patchwork that reconciled a spiritual position and an anarchist position might seem seemingly contradictory, and nevertheless, Capetillo charts a unique line of thought here, where she committedly defends the possibility of embodying the contradiction, that is, of being both a spiritist and an anarchist. One of the most important dimensions of spiritism influencing Capetillo's variety of espiritismo stems from the way spiritism methodologically understands itself as a moral philosophy. By centering ideas that drop out of the scientific revolution, spiritism sought to bridge the material and spiritual world in a systematic and rational capacity. So with the publication of the Spirits book, which comes out in 1857, and then the Mediums book, which comes out in 1859, Allan Kardec systemizes spiritism by giving it a procedural and structured character that could be easily disseminated. Spiritism subsequently could be understood as more than just a series of psychic experiences of an organized cult. The Spiritist book, written with the assistance of two mediums, as Kardec was not a medium himself, offers moral guidelines for action that embrace Christian morality, while at the same time rejecting the divinity of Christ and the organized structure of Christianity. Spiritism offered a bridge between religion and science that centered the possibilities of a rational basis for faith that linked social progress with spiritual progress. The goal of spiritism and the goal of social development and modernity, as articulated by Kardec, are arguably one and the same, and could be accomplished by inward spiritual reform, the outcome of which is the evolution of the human spirit. So spiritism arrives to Puerto Rico clandestinely by way of upper-class intellectuals, some Freemasons that had the socioeconomic, racial, and gendered privilege of education and movement. Given the implicit anti-clerical character of spiritism, the Spanish colonial state prohibited its practice. Nevertheless, spiritist centers started forming on the margins of the law. And by 1879, the year of Capetillo's birth, spiritism had taken root in a few towns in the south and the center of the island, as associations and centers started forming on the margins of the law of free association. After US occupation in 1898, the religious landscape of Puerto Rico also changed. as the new regime established a separation between church and state that did not exist previously. However, in practice, Spiritism was still marginal because it posed a threat to the power of organized religion that aligned itself with regimes of state power, most notably the Catholic Church and later other Christian Protestant varieties. Although Spiritism had its greatest impact in middle and upper class conglomerates of Puerto Rico, it also had resonances with rural, poor, working people neglected by the Catholic Church and already entrenched in their own spirit-oriented beliefs about the natural world, creating heterogeneous and creolized articulations of espiritismo that are still practiced to this day. Holding tight to moral claims about justice and charity, Spiritism threatened oppressive institutions at the level of the state, be it through the Spanish crown, the Catholic Church, or US occupation. Moreover, its central tenets in the Caribbean articulations were rife with liberatory potential, the existence of an intelligent superior being, the existence of a spirit that transcends death and is capable of communicating with humanity through mediumship, healing practices of both mental and physical kinds, the quest for progress and spiritual evolution, and commitment to justice, equality, and individual liberty, as well as the acceptance of life beyond the planet. In its Kardecian articulations, commitment to equality entailed gender equality, which in practice meant women were active participants of Spiritism and could hold positions of leadership. Spiritism offered women a moral philosophy that extended beyond belief and afforded them participatory power as they came to hold important roles as mediums, healers, and directors of centers and groups, as well as writers. Next slide. Thank you. So in Puerto Rico, Espiritismo could operate as an agent of social change, largely because of its metaphysical starting points. First, spirit was not taken to be sex and therefore could not treat gender as an inescapable hierarchy of inequality. It served as a promoter of autodidactic practices, presuming that the spirit could be transformed, thus allowing women the possibilities of moral and intellectual development. And third, Espiritismo held that women's temperaments were particularly adept to mediumship. Mediumship is key as it functions as the primary role of communication with the spirits. Mediums are an essential part of Espiritismo as they operate as the intermediaries that confirm some of its central tenets, including the authorship of Kardec's books. He could not have written those books without mediums, and those mediums were women. And I think that's a really, really important dimension of what's happening with the spiritism that Capetillo is drawing from. And so I hazard to say that without women, there really would be no Espiritismo. It's important to note that some of these roles largely echo women as vehicles of culture, an all too common trope in the context of modern nation building, which I don't wish to elide as it points to the contradictions of modernity that Capetillo waded through as she articulated her intellectual vision. However, the centrality of women in Espiritismo marks a node in the political frame of the times as it provided a moral framework from which to also disavow some of the perils of modernity that seated Puerto Rico as a footnote to history. Spiritism understands character as a reflection of spirit. Moral progress is the effect of a free will that evolves through reincarnation. And so given this moral philosophical structure, Spiritism appealed to people of various social classes. It gave different meaning and participatory possibilities to tradition, modernity, and spiritual life. And most importantly, it individualized the spiritual experience without foregoing scientific discovery. And so in doing so, Spiritism could be anti-clerical without rejecting Christian values by granting the individual, that is the subject of modernity, mastery over the supernatural. And here, in the context of the Caribbean, it arrives as a moral philosophy that directly disavowed the Catholic Church, not just because of its clerical structure, but as an oppressive colonial force that hindered moral progress. So Spiritism allowed Puerto Rican, and I would add also some Cuban freethinkers of Capetillo's time to bridge Enlightenment values with spiritual life. And it's for this reason that she's argumentatively able to hold onto a position that aligns Espiritismo with anarchism, as she understands both projects to have similar aims and goals. Liberatory moral progress found in the unearthing of ignorance through education that could bring people out of the faces of exploitation. Next slide. So for Capetillo, liberatory moral progress is achieved through educational intervention. If working people could be educated in different moral values, then they could participate in the project of modernity. That's her vision, that is her vision of modernity, anchored in economic sovereignty, anarcho-syndicalism, and a liberatory sexual ethics, albeit rather heteronormative. Capetillo's commitment to moral progress can be seen in the length of her writings, but most notably in an essay titled To My Daughter, Manuela Ledesma Capetillo, authored as the title indicates to her daughter, a daughter whose life she wasn't able to participate in due to the marriage kinship norms of her times, in which she systematizes and disseminates some of her key ideas as she talks to her daughter. More pointedly, this is the textual place where she bears witness to her ideas on spiritism and emancipation. The essay itself opens in a spiritual tone with the following words, and this is the first quote you have on the slides. Life eternal without possible end. I never taught you how to pray. You have to feel that need. You have not been baptized under any faith. I have sought for you the greatest of freedom in tastes and desires. I do not like violence. The only thing I desire and expect from you is that you be a good human being, not a routine Christian, no. To be an interpreter of Jesus's maxims without going to mass, without confessing or taking communion, without accepting any type of errors or lies of the absurd religions that have materialized, end quote. From the outset, we see that Capetillo is threading spiritism with her commitments, her political commitments. The critique of organized religion, the critique of violence, as well as the promulgation of Christian values with an anti-clerical stance are quickly centered as she educates her daughter on what it means to lead a good human life. As the essay proceeds, she expands on her spiritual ideas, telling her daughter, quote, I'm a believer in the diversity of existences, reincarnation, and therefore in the immortality of the soul. But many spiritists and anarchists are different, and many do not want to accept that the ultimate goal of both is the same. In the pages that follow, Capetillo juxtaposes anarchist and spiritist thought and argument by comparison, and not a criticism, these are her words, that demonstrates that the tension between each intellectual tradition, the root of which is found in mistaken reasoning on the problem of poverty. And I think this is one of the most interesting parts of the way in which she's bridging this stuff, right? Is that she takes the problem of poverty to be the point of departure to be able to make both positions commensurate. So Capetillo's commitments to anarchism shines as she immediately is critical of a capitalistic regime that, in her words, produces beggars. She states, if industrial and agricultural products go to waste in the storehouses, it's natural that there will be people who go hungry and destitute, end quote. The principles that undergird private property are fraudulent, deceptive, violent. There's no other way to create property, she states. The accumulation of capital through exploitation is robbery. And the law, she is quick to note, does not punish these acts, but rather hypocritically hides behind claims of virtue and honesty. Although both strands of thought call themselves rationalists, for her meaning, I think, derived from reason, as she states, spiritists diverge in that they do not attack private property, which rationally she thinks they should, right? And that she thinks it's implied in their moral framework that they should go after the very conditions that could create exploitation, but they don't. And I think here lies the tension. Spiritists fail to acknowledge that the perfection of the human spirit cannot come at the expense of others or in an environment systematically and structurally exploitative. In fact, such positioning would be hypocritical, irrational even, given that the values of justice are central to spiritist tenets. Hence, she tells her daughter, quote, I cannot accept a spiritism that observes criminal laws nor complies with any kind of authoritarian regime. I don't understand a spiritism that accepts customs, dogmas, and the rights of obsolete, so-called religious institutions. Neither do I understand it to adapt itself to the exploitative practices of capitalism. Those who do, she calls fraudulent spiritists. By centering the problem of poverty, Capetillo draws out the tensions between spiritism and anarchism, elucidating the ways she understands moral progress to be woven into the human experience. The goal of a good life is framed by the moral philosophy of spiritism, that is the perfection of the human spirit through ideals of peace, goodwill, harmony, truth, justice. But those goals will only be achievable through a political framework of anarchism that understands the triumph of the suffering of humanity through the abolition of capitalism and state control that generates exploitation. The weaving of anarchism, the political framework, and espiritismo, the moral framework, forms, I think, the bedrock of her intellectual patchwork. Capetillo's incessant argument on the possibilities of consolidating spiritism with anarchism speaks, I think, to the human need for spiritual life in the wake of modernity. and specifically in the context of Puerto Rico. Here, I think it's extremely important to return to Puerto Rico, as Capetillo is writing. The effects of the landfall of modernity in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean more broadly were brutal, necropolitical, built around pain, suffering, exploitation. The civilizing mission of conquest ensured that human progress was an exclusionary project whose actualization required the extermination and the disavowal of many human subjects. In the face of the catastrophes of modernity, often framed by the clerical structure of the Catholic Church, the human spirit is another part of the panorama of conquest. However, if we can, as Capetillo suggests, hold to the values of justice and peace without dehumanization, then the goals of espiritismo and anarchism come into a concomitant frame. As she so ardently insists when she writes, quote, "This planet to all of us and is not the privilege of only a few. Why are there so many injustices? We must contribute to even out these inequalities." Subsequently, we could ask what modernity, anarchism, and spiritism offered peripheralized subjects like Capetillo. And this is a question that draws from the work of Saidia Hartman, asking what anarchism largely offered. Moral progress and participation in the unfolding of human history was never really intended for people in the Caribbean, as the story is told. Yet an echo of the Haitian Revolution as the trial by fire of Enlightenment ideals reverberates in the vision of Capetillo as she, against all odds, assembles notions of belonging through political spiritual resistance that gave voice to the workers of the world, women of the world, from the trenches of exploitation that made European modernity possible, from a place that to this day lives and breathes in the wake of colonial imperial occupation without self-determination. Last slide. One of the key reasons Capetillo can thread a moral spiritual position, right, her espiritismo, with a political framework of anarchism is because her intellectual framing understands spiritual life as a human need, as much as sexual life for women is a human need, as much as liberation from exploitation is a human need. And she consistently talks about it in this way. And so in giving spiritual life primacy as a human need, that is, as a natural need, in her words, she's able to advocate for the commensurability. In the end, the goal is to better human life in all aspects. It's not just the fight for social justice, but rather radically restructuring favorable living conditions for all. The synthesis of spirituality with social activism, a spiritual activism, to borrow from Gloria Anzaldua's term, characterized Capetillo's life. And I think that's this is part of the kernel of where I got the idea to do this type of project, was reading Anzaldúa, who readily talks about spiritual activism, right? Talks about the linkings between politics and spiritual life. And then I thought, well, what would it mean to read Capetillo through her spiritual positions, first and foremost, and then using that to get to the politics, right? What would that generate? What type of reading would that generate? So driven by a desire to improve the human condition meant that she had to be ungovernable. And this is a term I borrow from Luisa Capetillo. Eliding categorization, often living in contradiction amidst catastrophic conditions engendered by modernity in Puerto Rico. To get her intellectual project off the ground, to give it life, was a contradiction in and of itself, and yet not an impossibility, as we're all gathered here today on what would have been her birthday, which I think is really beautiful. And she never found any idea to be too utopic to actualize. The most rational, the most humane way of living is by creating moral agency in subjects whose status as moral agents is continuously eclipsed. And here lies the project of education as the mechanism by which morality is transformed, and her moral framing with spiritual, but not religion. The human can be improved through its moral coding. The project of spiritual life could be social moral progress, the emancipation of women in their sexual lives, the downfall of colonial imperial projects, seemingly contradictory, but possible all the same. Thank you so much. Oh, wow, there's lots of people.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Rivera Berruet, for that amazing and just so fascinating approach to Capetillo, La Ingobernable. So, I mean, of course, I'm pretty sure Amy and I have several comments and questions to talk about. But let's see if anybody would like to, if you have any questions that you would like to add, we'll be checking the chat. So many things here that really, because when you first start reading Capetillo, you notice, and actually she acknowledges that you're going to find contradictions because she's reconciling different influences that may seem to be at odds, but she's able to get to that core aspect of how can I develop this moral philosophy for human improvement, right? Yeah. So the fact that, through Spiritism, through anarchism, and that she actually juxtaposes them and brings them together, we see also that highly intellectual approach that she uses. And, when we find texts that, again, at first, sometimes we don't have, especially in our literary training, for those of us in literature, to directly approach that type of text, right? Because they're outside the canon. So I do have some other remarks, but I think Lorena had her hand up. So Lorena, if you want to unmute yourself. And
that was actually a mistake. Sorry.
Oh.
Well, I've followed it closely and I'm very interested in this, in particular in how it relates to translation, but I don't have a question right now.
Okay, all right. But it's good that you're here with us. So several remarks, right? Like the fact that, Stephanie, when you mentioned that Capetillo is also, like how to use the tools for, what we would call today respectability, right? And the tools of being intelligible for this modernity and this capitalist society, one of those tools, of course, is education. And yet how through that concept of the contradiction that you mentioned, right? And the reference here to, so Dominican scholar Lorgia Garcia Peña, that there is the diction, right, of empire, of coloniality, so how to counter that. So, like it makes me think of the tools that we also have to develop as we read, coming in from different disciplines, from philosophy, from history, from translation, in my case, coming in as approaching Capetillo in connection to other feminist women writers at the time, Ana Roque, Carmela Olate Sanjurjo. Capetillo is actually offering something that it's in connection, but she's offering something that comes from that counter archive that Jorel, our second keynote, has published about. So one thing that, among many things that really struck me, is that you used the word landfall twice, and I'm sure that was very intentional, right? Yeah. This idea, because it's a powerful image of the landfall of modernity. We have a nation, the Puerto Rican nation, right, that has gone from one colonial rule to another without being able to be sovereign at any point. And then you have this landfall of modernity. So it's a very powerful expression that conveys a lot of also what Capetillo was grappling with. So I don't know, like how did you come up with that? It's quite a trope. So
thank you so much for that. Those remarks. I really appreciate the perspective, right, of what catches the ear in the writing itself. So, part of the reason I use the word landfall has to do with really highlighting that, once colonization, takes off, it's not just the arrival of mechanisms of exploitation that arrive, right? But it's all of the ideas that also arrive with them. And we don't often tend to think of ideas as being as pernicious, right? Or as being as violent as the type of thing that could make a landfall, right? A
Mhm.
landfall. And so I think it was part of trying to draw to the materiality of the fact that ideas arrive with people, right? They arrive with particular sets of material conditions. They don't just fall from the sky, right? Which is the battle I fight with my colleagues in philosophy who talk about ideas as if they're like these like free floating things detached from humans, right? When in fact they're intimately tied with one another, right? You can't have one without the other. And so the language of landfall there is to really mark the fact that not only does it arrive, it doesn't arrive neutrally. It arrives through Freemasonry, it arrives through elite intellectuals that didn't necessarily have the best interests of the people in mind, right? It arrives with a desire for the growth of capital, right? And then at the same time, you have the possibilities of someone like Capetillo who can take that up, right? In very specific ways. And so I think that's part and parcel why that term, I continuously use it. And so this is part of a broader book project where the first chapter is actually on rethinking what modernity means in the context of the Hispanophone Caribbean. And so drawing from the work of Lorgia Garcia Peña, right, is also very strategic there, right? Because I think she's after something really important, right? It's not just weapons, right? It's also diction, right? And so that is part of what produces what we call the modern condition. What does that look like from the perspectives of these nodes, of these places that never really get talked about, right? And it ends up being very contradictory, right?
Yeah, like when that diction or dictions arrive, make their landfall in places that continue to be the margins of the margins, and that is also by design, right? And also how that it becomes like something that entrenches the colonial subject as well. And operating from that approach, I think it's just, it's you gave us a lot of ideas here that we'll be thinking about for quite a while. Also, the quotes from that essay letter to her daughter, to Manuela, that she tells her, I don't want you to be this routine Christian, but I want you to be a good person. That's sort of like that morality of, being a good person is not attached to those tools of civility and of being, intelligible to the state as a good person, right? Upper class, white in the Caribbean context and all that. But also that she instills in her that it's not just, this is what I want you to do. And actually, instead of, she adds to her, she says, instead of going to church and listening to mass, it's like, actually go to the prisons and visit the people who are there, because of those imposed material conditions that make people, out of desperation, steal something for food, not even like, it's not for wealth, and then they end up in the prison. So the fact that she also wants that activism in her daughter, and that's what she's, instilling in her, it's pretty amazing. So I was very delighted that you included those quotes from when she addresses her daughter, because there's also that sense that I need to leave this legacy here, and I need to communicate this to you. And I know that the nuns are not always communicating what I send you because they think I'm this very scandalous woman.
Yeah, and I think the one of the reasons why she's such a fascinating figure is because she has that activist bridge, right? We're not just talking about someone who's writing and has these political intellectual commitments. We're talking about someone who's trying to live them out, right? And so her life really becomes a testament to the political possibilities of what she's writing about. And you just don't get that with a lot of figures, right? I mean, all the people that we engage with and study don't necessarily, it's like a common question, right? Like, do we see people enacting the political commitments they actually have? I mean, this woman tried. She really tried, right? And so it's not just in reading what she wrote, but it's also in looking at how she lived, that you also get an archive of her intellectual positions. And I think the spiritual stuff is where that really shines through, right? Like, instead of going to church, go visit a prison. Instead of, going to church, go feed the poor, right? Not because it's what you're told to do, but because it's what it means to be a good person, right? And that you see that reflected in how she then, I think the fact that it's her daughter is also really important. And I'm still kind of sitting with you know, what does it mean to write something that speaks to a child, right? As a structure of writing, I think about even something like Between the World and Me, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates writing to his son, right? So this practice of what it means to prepare a child, right? Maybe not even biological, I don't even like a kin of some sort, for a really messed up world.
Yes.
A
Yes.
world that's really not structured for you to exist in it, right? What do you tell them, right? Especially when you're committed to resisting some of that.
Yeah, and what do you tell them and how, right? Because
How?
it's a letter that can be read as an essay, right?
Yeah,
And you presented
yeah,
it as an essay
yeah.
because it's kind of like a way also that I need to disseminate this, and people need to, you know, because a lot of people, it's not just her daughter, who are going to be growing in this very contradictory and violent, you know, the violence of being a colonial subject. So the other thing I wanted to remark, and I really hope, oh, okay, no, we have a comment here. So here it says, so this is Isabel Guzzardo, and I hope I pronounced the last name right. I'm really interested in this genre of writing to younger generations. Hortense Spillers in The Time and Crisis discusses how Ta-Nehisi Coates writes to his son and how Baldwin writes to his nephew.
Right, right.
So yeah, it's like in many ways we see that, you know, writing directly to someone has that sort of like, here's perhaps more intimate, but it's also like you're seeing the person wanting to leave that legacy for that new younger generation.
And Nancy and Stephanie, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. It was fascinating and super fun to hear your perspective and sort of your theoretical lens and just shedding new light for me on her text. So thank you so much for your talk today. Just picking up on this thread of the letter to her daughter. I noticed on that slide where you had that citation, you also had the front of the front cover of Ensayos Libertarios, which is one of the texts that, of course, we translated or that we worked on together. And you know, it just, I had read that letter prior, but when you read it this time out, I was just struck by how that is the same message. I mean, exactly. That goes from one text to another, like the consistency of that message and that rootedness and that position was just struck me at that time. And I thought about, you know, one of the things that Nancy and I have been talking a lot about over these 2 years are the many different voices that she inhabits or that come out of her in these texts. Not only is she speaking from her own understanding, which she's always doing, but she is acting as a medium in some ways to a lot of these philosophers and activists and labor organizers that she's citing, which I think is so cool. And as a translator, it was really fun to track down the original citations and all that stuff. But what struck me when you mentioned the letter is, wow, when she's in Ensayos Libertarios, she's talking about the same thing to sort of apostrophically to the you know, to the masses, to the people at the rally, to the folks in the factories. And then in the letter, I would be curious to look back at both of those texts again to see how her address changes, if it does, and a different way that she might encapsulate that meaning and that text, in effect, how she translates it for a particular audience. So anyway, I just thought that piece was really enlightening to me. And so I wanted to say thanks for bringing that up. Really
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think part of what makes that essay so unique, particularly, you know, in the context when you're looking at the length of her work, right? If you sit down and do a marathon read, as I call them, of a figure, right, is that I think part of the tone that you get in that letter is that it starts to tilt towards the spiritual. It starts to tilt towards not just here's the political stuff you have to be committed to, but like you got to lead a life that is good, right? And that starts to take on a different tone. And I suspect that has to do with the fact that the address is her daughter, right? The address isn't just the, you know, workers of the world, right? Or that type of address that you see in maybe other places in her writing, right? That it's something way more intimate, right? And so then things about spiritual life might rise to the surface that otherwise go a little bit more unnoticed, right? Or are there, but you know, we don't tend to pay attention to them as much because how, right? How would you do that? Particularly because the spiritual framing she has is already built on this the individual model, right? I mean, that's why Spiritism was so threatening, right? It was like, we don't need any of this like structure stuff. I can have my spiritual life and I don't need the Catholic Church to do that, right? And so I think it's precisely because it hones in on that, you know, the intersubjective, the one-on-one, the if I had my daughter in front of me, what would I tell her? That I think all this stuff all of a sudden might become more present, right, as you're reading it, right? Not that it's not there in other places, but I think in this essay, it's like, it's there, right? You cannot ignore that she's after something spiritual alongside the political.
Yeah, and it's interesting that in that statement to her daughter, she's not citing, whereas like in Cyrus Lucretarius, she is citing. She's
yeah.
not, you know, it's sort of like what you're saying, like that more personal, she transfers onto somebody who's writing about it, and she can cite the book, or she can say, read this, or read that, or read the other.
Right.
That's a really great point. Yeah.
Yeah. And that, I mean, I think also back to kind of Nancy's first point about the tools of intelligibility, right? Right, especially when we're reading her, is who does she need to be intelligible to in a letter to her daughter versus who does she have to be intelligible to when she's making an address from a podium at a tobacco factory, right? I mean, those are very different states of intelligibility, right? And the tools she's gonna pull from are gonna be different, I imagine, right? And so that fact about the citation, I think might be one flag of exactly that, right? Is that who are we writing for, right? You know, noting that some of her work, or a good length of her work, is really written to be spoken, right? And here it is a letter to her daughter that I imagine, given the relationship that she had to forge with her daughter, was never going to be a conversation she could have in person. And I think that's also a really important part of this, right? Is that, you know, this is not, she couldn't sit down with her daughter in the ways in which we might imagine someone sitting down with their daughter and saying, hey, like, this is what's out there, right? And here's what, you know, there's a distance already there. By virtue of what's happening in her life, right? And what's happening in the background, that I think is also really intimate and sad. I mean, it's and I think, again, this is why the spiritual stuff to me just resonated so much. I was like, this is so incredibly sad, right? That this woman has to do this, that she has to mother in this way, right? And I wonder what it's like to have to do that. I mean, I'm not a parent, but I think about what it would mean to write something like that for my niece, or something like that if I knew I'd never get to see her, right? Or something happened where, right, what would it mean to author something like that versus authoring something that's, you know, to be read at a rally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So we have time if there's like anybody has a comment or anything. And also, I mean, again, Stephanie, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And that concept of, you know, which is, I mean, it's obvious, but it's good when we hear it, like that the unruly way of thinking, because it's that the way of thinking, the way of enacting, you know, her thoughts and bringing, you know, those words and actions together. And I see that Jorel has his hand up.
Jorel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this amazing presentation, Stephanie, and thank you, Nancy and Amy, for organizing such an exciting event. I have so many notes. I ask a question, but I'll pick your brain at another moment because there's so many things to think through. But I was really interested in the ways that you showed us the complexities of Espiritismo, right? How it highlights spiritual life, but yet tied to this notion of science and the scientific revolution, right? And so I was thinking about this and wanted to ask you about your understanding of early 20th century anarchism from a similar sort of lens. because I think that it's also, it's a product of the Enlightenment. It's also full of contradictions. And so I was wondering if you could see, Capetillo's anarchism as and I think this ties to your larger book project. Is it another project of modernity that it's being articulated, or is it being resignified in the colonial context of Puerto Rico? And so, so I know that, for example, communism was very materialist. There was no space for the spirit, but anarchism offers that fluidity. And so I guess I know that you're looking at the spiritual side, but if you saw those contradictions also in the political repertoire of anarchism, and ultimately, I think my question that I keep thinking, is anarchism a colonial enterprise? Like is it deeply, thinking about coloniality, not colonialism, like is anarchism inherently or ontologically colonial? And so how she navigated those complications and contradictions?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I can't wait to have a more in-depth conversation about this stuff with you. But thank you for the question. So that's a loaded question. Is anarchism a colonial, what was it? A colonial?
Is it
ontologically colonial? I wish I could ask you that question because you're the anarchist scholar expert in the room. But here's what I'll say. I think I don't take any particular intellectual or political, project, right, as being a pure one. I'm not even sure that there is such a thing as like a pure notion of a thing, right, that's divorced from where it goes, who speaks it, how it gets put, right? So all of that becomes really meaningful. And so I would say how anarchism arrives, right, to places like Puerto Rico or Cuba, or the nodes of the movement of anarchism has to take account of the colonial ordering of the world, right? I mean, because anarchism is a global thing. It's not just something that's happening in one place. It's España, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, right? I mean, your work elucidates that. So it's all of these nodes, but I think we would be, we would definitely make a misstep if we didn't also account for how the colonial project starts to make the viability of certain ideas move in certain directions over others, right? Give credence to certain voices, bodies, and places over others, right? I think to me, that's where the juice is, right? Is taking account of that. And so that's, I guess, the flip side, right? Is I try to give a reading of Espiritismo that could give a little more complex, nuanced understanding of like, yo, where do these ideas, how do they even get here, right? Hence the landfall, right? They weren't there, they arrived somehow, right? Bananas arrived, Espiritismo arrived, right? I mean, really trying to think, I mean, yeah, and so how does that happen? And so I think the project of anarchism, I think certainly gave wiggle room for her to be able to hold on to, right, these threads, right, maybe in ways that the communist project and the way it's spelled out didn't give as much wiggle room, right, in the textual articulation. But I mean, at the end of the day, she's re-signifying through and through. I don't think you can get that, that's for sure, right? I mean, she's taken and she's re-signifying a lot, right? That's the thing. She's re-signifying, like the French, what is it, Magdalene Bernet on free love, right? That essay. You have Kardec, right? There's a lot of people in the room, right? It's not just anarchism writ, or spiritism writ large. But I think we need to do better at taking account, right, of how even the movement of these radically transformative and resistant ideas also is made possible by the project of modernity. And you don't get one without the other. And we have to swallow that one. Like that has to be the starting point. And I think if we take that as the starting point, our readings are going to get way more interesting, right? Because now there's a lot more players, many more players in the room. And there's no pure way of reading it, right? I mean, there's I'm blanking on her last name. Her name is Madeline. She works on Ofelia Rodriguez Acosta, who's another one of the interlocutors that I work with from the Caribbean. And she talks, you know, she says, look, I'm not giving a pure way of reading anything, right? But rather I'm giving modes of reading, right? I'm giving plural ways of reading that if we invite other interlocutors into the room, really complicate, right? The story that we've been telling or has been told, right? And I think that's also really important with someone like Capetillo in this moment, right? Because she is getting a lot of attention, right? I mean, us being here and there's 34 participants in the room, right? I mean, that itself probably is reflective of that. The most recent republication of her works with the essays at the end. I mean, she is getting, there's actually an event in Puerto Rico this weekend on Capetillo also in person, right? So again, there's these celebrations of this individual, and I want to get ahead of, right? Flat readings, right? I mean, I want to give her a very complicated starting point for conversation, and that involves saying, you know, nothing's pure here, and neither are we, right?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this wonderful keynote and for everybody who attended this portion. So Julie, we can probably stop the recording here for this part.